Test, test. Good. Committee will come to order without objection. The chair is authorized to declare recess at any time pursuant to Committee Rule 2, House Rule 11, Clause 2. The chairman may postpone further proceedings today on the question of approving any measure or matter or adopting an amendment for which a recorded vote is ordered. I now recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, to lead us in the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank the gentleman. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 1631, the Protecting and Enhancing Public Access to Codes Act, for purposes of markup, and move that the committee report it favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1631.
Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing up this bill in a timely fashion. In just the last few months, there have been direct attacks on the copyrightability of codes. Essential codes, like the ones contained in these books, have been produced at no cost to the government for many years and then adopted into regulations for safe building and the like. Let there be no doubt, if you want to build a house and you don't want to pay attention to the code, go ahead. But then try to insure it against an insurance company that wants to know it was built safely. Or for that matter, sell it to somebody where you say, well, I did it myself and I did it a better way. The reality is that these codes are both laws in a sense and guidance. People have a right to build something in their backyard any way they want, but we rely on the fire department to come and rescue us if it burns down. We count that people who visit will not be electrocuted by a false or incorrectly installed product. Therefore, we have been working on this bill for quite a time and over years have established a balance that includes, the last time we had a markup, useful amendments which will be brought in the nature of a substitute. The bill does strike an important balance between restoring IP rights to SDOs and ensuring that citizens and businesses have full access to standards they require to use by law. Government agencies and legislatures have long relied on the expertise and resources of nonprofit SDOs to develop safe technical codes and keep America safe. For decades, SDOs, the government, and the public have operated under a simple framework that worked for everyone. SDOs save the government and taxpayers millions of dollars by taking the burden of hiring experts, holding meetings to forge industry consensus, and drafting a continuing and updating standard for technical codes. The government relies on codes developed by SDOs, occasionally incorporating some by reference into laws and regulation. The public benefit of these safety improvements resulting from the use of these codes is immeasurable. The SDOs have copyright protection for their codes, which enables them to recoup their cost by selling these copies to construction companies and equipment manufacturers and others. In my hand, as I said, is the National Electrical Code, which has been copyrighted for a decade. We would not likely be here today if it were not for the fact that the digital age means that few are using the paper as much as they are using machine searchable, quick reference on their laptop or notebook or the like. But without copyright code, we would cease to have the updating of these codes. We would never again receive the kind of support we need, but rather we would have to pay for it and then, candidly, as a member of this legislature, perhaps get the compromise of a legislature rather than the well-thought-out and well-reasoned safety standards of people who have to fight fires or respond to failures, including buildings falling down. We have seen an activist recently try to eliminate or disregard these codes, and they have done so not because they want to have a public interest, but in this gentleman's opinion, because they would like to offer for cheap or free, well, attaching advertising that would allow them to monetize these products without paying for a copyright. Therefore, we believe this legislation does allow the public to have full access to any code, but in fact, as a win-win, if they want to have an enhanced capability, a paper copy or the like, they would have to pay a nominal fee, one that only reimburses and does not lead to profit for the SDOs. And with that, I thank the Speaker, or the Chairman, and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Nadler, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, the last time we sat down to mark up the Pro Codes Act, I said that this bill is sensible bipartisan legislation that strikes a balance between copyright protection and public access to information. My opinion has not changed. This legislation would allow standards developing organizations, or SDOs, to retain their copyrights when their standards are incorporated by reference into the law, so long as they make a copy available online at no cost. It continues to be a reasonable approach to a clear uncertainty in the law, and I intend to vote yes when the roll is called. But in the intervening months since we began consideration of this legislation, we missed many opportunities to strengthen the bill through a better process. It was obvious at the time that the bill had not gone through regular order, which would have enabled members to hear from stakeholders with various viewpoints, to make any necessary refinements, and to convince more of our colleagues that this bill is the right path forward. Instead, we charged right into a markup, and we were unable to complete consideration. That was 9 months ago. 9 months in which we could have held hearings, brought in experts, and considered the right legislative balance to striking the bill before it heads to the floor. But none of that occurred, and now we are right back where we started, hoping for a different result. There is a benefit to regular order. I know that some of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle disagree on principle with this approach to allowing SDOs to retain their copyright. I respect their opinion, and if we had held a hearing on this issue, this markup would not be their only chance to argue their cause. I'm also well aware that there are some within the standard-setting community who would prefer a different legislative approach to protecting intellectual property rights. Formal engagement on this issue by the committee could have led to a stronger bill supported by more SDOs. If there was a compromise to be had, we would not know, because unfortunately we were not given the opportunity to find out. Be that as it may, I still believe that this legislation would improve our laws by protecting SDOs' intellectual property rights while ensuring that Americans have access to the laws that bind them. SDOs are organizations that develop and publish standards to govern certain highly technical industries. These best practices govern everything from consumer safety and household utility installation to home electrical wiring and plumbing planning. SDOs make sure that your house won't catch on fire, your plumbing is up to code, your water boiler is installed correctly, and everything in between. You rely on your local contractor, and your contractor relies on their SDO standards. State and local legislatures, which generally do not have the requisite experts on staff to write highly technical standards, often choose to incorporate SDO-developed standards by reference into the law. In this way, legislators can key their state's laws to codes that are regularly updated as mistakes are fixed, new methods are developed, and technological advancements are incorporated into best practices. These codes do not suddenly exist out of nowhere. They are not simply auto-generated by AI. When SDOs bring their technical experts together to set basic rules of the road for their industries, these model codes are the final product. With this rigorous development and dedication to constant improvement, it is no wonder that states and localities want to adopt these codes by reference into law. However, this practice exists at the crux of a dilemma in American intellectual property law today. On one hand, everyone typically benefits when local, state, or federal legislatures adopt content developed by SDOs into their laws. The laws benefit from dynamic safety codes created by experts in their fields, and SDOs in turn benefit from more customers for their published works. If the copyright to that material were taken away, the incentives for the SDOs would disappear, and the mutually beneficial relationship would no longer exist. On the other hand, Americans also have an essential interest in knowing that they can access the laws that govern them. Because of this principle, Once a code is enacted into law, Americans must have access to this information, because if you can't find the code, you don't know how it will affect you. The Pro-Codes Act seeks to find the middle ground between these two competing interests. This legislation would allow SDOs to retain their copyrights when their standards are incorporated by reference into the law, so long as they make a copy available online at no cost. Under the bill, SDOs could still put their code in a book or an easy-to-use app and sell those products to their members and related companies. This would ensure that it is still financially viable to continue to innovate and to update and develop these codes. But at the same time, the standards would have to be made available online for all the world to see. There could be print controls and copy controls, but the law would still be publicly accessible. I thank Chairman Issa and Congresswoman Ross for introducing this bipartisan legislation. It is a reasonable approach to a thorny problem in American law, and I regret that it has not been given the process that it deserves to ensure that it is the best possible product. I urge all members to support this legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Without objection, all other opening statements will be included in the record. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California for the purpose of offering an amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a
Without
substitute.
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute will be considered as read and shall be considered base text for the purpose of the amendment. The chair recognizes the gentleman from California to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. The amendment nature of a substitute to the Pro-Codes Act includes language improving the original bill. During our first markup on the bill, there were concerns about whether the bill adequately made information publicly available and accessible online. That has clearly been corrected. Additionally, as we listened, we heard concerns both from Mr. Bishop and Mr. Fry, and they worked together with committee staff and ourselves to craft language that we believe takes care of two problems. One, the online availability in a machine searchable format, and one that was more technical from Mr. Fry. Under Section 3A, the language now ensures that no personally identifiable information is collected without the consent of the user. And under Section 3B of the language now requires that, and I'll quote it, information be made available in a format that includes a searchable table of contents and index, or equivalent aids to facilitate the location of specific content. And I just want to point out that the help we had on that, we believe that much of this would have been done, but it's better to have it in the law requiring it that be done. Mr. Chairman, I once again reiterate, we are today agreeing to a partial taking of people's copyright rights that would ordinarily be theirs because it is for the public good, but preserving the ability for them to reasonably monetize so that they can recoup the cost of what they do in the public interest. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Who seeks recognition?
Chairman?
Gentlelady from, I'm going to go first to Mr. Fry, then the gentlelady from California.
All right.
All right. Gentleman from South Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Look, I believe the Pro-Codes Act is a good bill and a reasonable middle ground to a real problem. Once granted a copyright, standards should be afforded the full protection under the law, regardless of whether or not they are incorporated by reference into any law or regulation. If organizations like the National Fire Protection Association can't copyright these standards that they put so much time and energy and resources into, they might as well stop putting time into doing any of it. And who would benefit from that? Possibly government bureaucrats? No one would want that. Who would do the work? In South Carolina, the National Fire Protection Association standards have been incorporated by reference in many areas of statewide fire safety regulation. I have spoken personally with Horry County Fire Chief Joseph Tanner in the district that I represent. In our conversations, he told me about that he's not only responsible to the public, but he's also responsible for the safety of his own firefighters. Reliable codes put forth by the National Fire Protection Association allow him to keep both the public and the firefighters themselves safe. Mr. Chairman, I request unanimous consent to enter into the record a letter from the fire chief from Horry County on February 2nd, 2024 in support of the Pro-Codes Act.
Without objection.
Every day, people in my district rely on these standards to protect the public. For example, the Myrtle Beach Convention Center relies on NFPA standards for its exhibition safety requirements. I can't go back to my district and tell people in Myrtle Beach that the convention center might not be able to rely on these standards forever because Congress hasn't taken enough action yet to protect them. I can't explain that South Carolina will have to create a whole new government agency to create these standards that would be funded by the taxpayers. And as we know, government doesn't have all the answers and often doesn't do it efficiently or effectively. To put a finer point, I realize that the current system isn't perfect, as has been talked about by both the majority and the minority, but it works well enough, and we ought to protect it. I did have some privacy concerns, as Mr. Issa pointed out, with the Pro Codes bill. There's nothing inherently wrong with collection of information from a user, but that should be at the opt-in of the user itself. The amendment, in the nature of a substitute, incorporates that. It would prohibit standard development organizations from using personal identifiable information of users unless they have received an affirmative express consent or for whatever they want to use it for. Whereas purely commercial websites may employ the opt-out, we would require that they opt in ahead of time. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and the underlying bill in its final passage. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
For more than a decade, I've worked on the issue of making sure that the laws are accessible to the people. I've worked with activists, civil liberty activists, as well as helping write amicus briefs to the court. And I'd like to note that finally, our efforts to make sure that the law is free were successful. In the courts, they have found that the law cannot be made accessible only by paying. As the court said in the D.C. Circuit, the legal text, the law, falls plainly outside the realm of copyright protection because of fair use. The Supreme Court of the United States reaffirmed that if every citizen is presumed to know the law, it needs no argument to show that all should have free access to its contents. Now, this bill would try to overturn what the courts have finally decided, that people cannot be held to a standard of law if they have to pay or give up personal rights or information to know what that law is. It's not at all clear to me, actually, that even if this bill were to become law, it would succeed in defeating the concept of fair use, but let's assume for the moment that it would. I think it's worth going through what someone has to do, even with the manager's amendment, to get access to the law in the so-called reading rooms. First, you have to accept all cookies that include tracking and analysis that go to third-party vendors. It says that these cookies can be set through our site for our advertising parties to build a profile of your interests. Before you enter the reading room, you have to create an account. In order to do that, you have to submit personal information, such as electronic mail address, and if you do that, you're automatically added to the electronic mailing list. Those lists send several messages a week, and there's no way to unsubscribe. Now that the cookies have been accepted and the user's created an account, before entering the reading room, the user is presented with the terms of use. Now, I understand there's an affirmative consent, but you're not going to, under the manager's amendment, you can't get access to the law unless you agree. In order to do that, you would have to indicate that they sell direct your information to commercial sites. Scrolling down, you would be presented with a number of limitations. It's clearly stated that you could not use the information. It's only for review. It's also clear that you cannot download, reproduce, store, or make available on a network any of the standards. In other words, you could not even discuss these standards with others concerned about the law. The user also is asked to give up judicial review, which I think is contrary to contract law. The user also has to agree to indemnify ASTM, including paying attorney's fees, as well as there are several disclaimers of warranty, but we're not done. The user has to also agree that the laws of Pennsylvania will govern your actions no matter where you are, and that the full range of cookies, including tracking and cookie analysis that will go to third-party vendors, is okay. The notes on targeting cookies are extreme. And finally, the user has reached the standard question. Note that there's no search, well, the search capability is of the index only, not of the actual document. I'd note also that the document is not accessible to the disabled, and I think violates the Americans with Disabilities Act. If the user tries to print the standard, one is presented with a blank piece of paper. There's no cut and paste capability. One can't take a paragraph and put it in an email to a fellow citizen to discuss. Having finished reading the document, if the user hits the back button, you get an error, and you have to start at the very beginning to go through. I think it's fundamental, it's only right, that if we're going to ask Americans to be governed by a law, that they should have the capacity to read that law, to discuss the law with others, to disseminate the law and have the full debate. That's what the courts have found, and I would hope that we would not try and overturn their sound decision. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, the San Jose Public Library, the Mercury News in San Jose, the San Jose Spotlight, the Santa Cruz Sentinel, the Silicon Valley Voice, and for that matter, virtually every tech company in the gentlelady's district requires that you accept cookies, requires that you give a name and an email and verify. There's nothing nefarious there. But even if one were to take everything that was just said at face value, that is not a searchable website based on a standard we are creating here today. We are setting a standard of availability. But let's just briefly go through and assume that the gentlelady is right, that in fact it's fair use and that should simply be done away with, no cookies, just there. Who would host it? Would San Jose, at its own expense, host this entire group of books, thousands of pages each? Would they build a website that was machine searchable and do so for free? I'm sorry, but I'm a fellow Californian, and the gentlelady's district and its city, in fact, require that you log in to get services, not just an outside group. And let's just go through one thing that I think we have to understand here today. We use standard essential patents to get on the Wi-Fi, to, in fact, do all kinds of things in our daily life. Most of the products we hold in our hand have incorporated standard essential patents. But we don't consider that intellectual property fair use to simply rip off because, in fact, it's been incorporated. We recognize that we will limit the funding that they can draw from it. We set standards for how much royalty a standard essential patent can get, but we don't invalidate the patent. Here today, we're saying that the hard work in copyright shall be invalidated. Let me make something perfectly clear. The reason we are so resistant to simply walking away from this problem is you walk away from this product or this problem, this 1,000 pages no longer happens.
Would the gentleman yield?
No, I didn't use any of your time. We, in fact, must today understand that this is a public good. And let's understand a couple of other things. The gentlelady talked about contract law and sort of the willing buyer, willing seller. No city has to adopt the code. Any city can decide that they're going to write their own code. Any state can decide it. And I stand in a state like California, and they establish a lot of their stuff on their own. They're choosing to have a guidance that, for example, my good friend Mr. Massey used in building his home, but did not honor fully. That's fine. It's between him as an insurance company, him and the next buyer of the home. The fact is, you don't have to build to these things, but if you want to get a permit that says that you've used standards that people can rely on, your insurance company doesn't have to inspect every plug and every wire in a wall that's already been closed up. These kinds of codes of safety protect Americans every day, and as Mr. Fry said, they also protect the firemen that come to your house when an event happens. They also protect everyone who comes and just plugs a shaver into a wall in your home as a guest. We rely on this guidance. This guidance changes constantly, and we're talking about thousands of pages by multiple different standards organizations. None of them have to be adopted by cities or states. They choose to do that rather than have their own. Additionally, like any other copyright, if the state of California said to the National Electric code producers, look, we have to be able to have on our website at our expense an advanced searching capability, and we want to have it with no login because we want to make it available to everyone who's in California, and that's a condition of us adopting it. That's a willing buyer, willing seller, and the fact is they could negotiate that. They haven't chosen to do that. They've chosen to continue to get free service by simply having a reference. And again, they don't have to grant you a permit. You don't have to have it. If you want to work on your home all by yourself and do what you want to do, great. But you do so at the peril of everyone who visits and everyone who might buy the home. And I yield back.
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman yields back. I'm going to go to the gentlelady from North Carolina, then I'll come back to the gentlelady from California. Gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady.
Thank you. I am proud to lead this bill along with Representative Issa. Since the last time we began to mark up this bill, I've spoken with a number of members of this committee and stakeholders on both sides to see how we can alleviate concerns that were brought up. I also believe that the ANS and several other amendments we hear today will work to address some of the issues that we have discussed during the last markup. The Pro Codes Act is a common sense solution that balances providing free public access to codes and standards that have been incorporated into the law while ensuring that important code development work can continue. And that development work is in peril if we do not pass this bill. The industry codes and standards that keep us healthy and safe every day are created by SDOs, Standards Development Organizations, which regularly convene experts to write and modify standards to ensure electrical codes, building codes, crisis management codes, and more are up to date. Importantly, the standards SDOs put out are approved by consensus and adopted by industries voluntarily. However, Congress and federal agencies have recognized repeatedly that governments should rely on these standards whenever possible, which has led to their incorporation into the law. I firmly believe that codes that have been incorporated into the law should be available to the public at no cost, for free. That's why this bill requires these codes to be made available online, again, for free. That said, in order to develop the codes, it costs something. SDOs cannot operate without funding, and they earn that funding by maintaining copyrights to their codes as works of original authorship, which allows them to sell print copies and subscription access to these codes, and to fund code development at no cost to the taxpayer. These purchased formats are typically used by builders, electricians, and other professionals who regularly refer to the codes in their line of work and do not want to rely on web page versions. Ultimately, this bill strikes a critical balance between enabling public access to codes, again, for free, that are incorporated into law, and ensuring copyrights are protected and able to provide revenue to organizations that create and update the standards we need to stay safe and healthy. Mr. Chairman, at the appropriate time, I will offer an amendment, but I am in support of your amendment at this time, and I yield back.
Would the lady like to offer an amendment in the form of, to the amendment and a substitute at this time?
Yes, I have an amendment at the desk. Thank you. Providing the public with free online access to...
Can we get a copy?
Gentlelady, if you,
Yes.
you've already had your,
I was asking for a copy of the amendment.
Yeah.
okay.
We'll have the copy.
The clerk will report the amendment, and they'll distribute copies.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1631 offered by Ms. Ross of North Carolina, page 7, line 17, insert, quote, that conforms with the accessibility.
Without objection, the amendment can be considered as read, and the gentlelady from North Carolina is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, this amendment is in response to the very constructive feedback we got from the public and to help our residents and citizens who may have disabilities. So providing the public with free online access to standards incorporated by reference is one of the main goals of the bill. And we want to ensure that transparent access extends to people with disabilities. I've worked on these issues for a long time, not just for this bill, but for access to people with disabilities in a wide variety of ways. This amendment requires that free online access mandated by the Pro Codes Act be compliant with Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is the regulation that governs how federal agencies must provide access to electronic data and information for people with disabilities. We've listened to feedback about this topic and believe this amendment provides an important protection to ensure accessibility to codes referenced in the law. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. I now recognize the gentlelady from California for
To strike the last word on the amendment.
gentlelady's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I understand the gentlelady from North Carolina is offering this in good faith so that I think essentially the blind would be able to access what is available to others. And for that, I have no objection. The problem is that it still prohibits anyone, including the blind, from accessing the law fully, which is the underlying problem with this bill. The chairman earlier said, who would ever post these laws incorporated by reference for free? And the answer is obvious. Publicresource.org has done that, and that's why they were sued by the standard-setting organizations in lengthy litigation where I submitted a number of amicus briefs, including one in which the chairman himself signed on. So that is readily available. And I would note also that the standard-setting organizations lost in court 4 years ago, and they have continued to develop these standards. Losing in court didn't prevent them from doing that. It's worth noting that the standards are actually drafted usually by volunteer experts from the sectors, including industry and academia and government. But then the SDOs sell the standards for prices that can reach thousands of dollars. I would note that generally the SDOs lobby then to make the standards they publish part of the law, either federal or state statutes by regulation. And then these standards become binding on the American people. They would have to pay to find out what the law is and to debate the law. If the state legislature wants to adopt these standards, and the citizens want to have a discussion about that, they couldn't copy the standards and then engage in robust discussion. Those who filed briefs along with me arguing for the law should be free include public resource, the NAACP, the Cato Institute, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, California's Sonoma County and the State and Local Government Employees Union asked me. The chairman indicated that, you could just decline to accept these standards. That's actually not the case in California and many other states. The states adopt the building codes, and cities and counties are bound by them. They're not able to opt out. It's the state law. And in fact, to find out what the state law is, the cities and counties have to pay up. That's why the county of Sonoma was submitting an amicus brief to the courts saying that the law needs to be free. They need to have full access, and in some cases, those who adopt the law would have to pay, actually, to find out and to fully explore what they have adopted. So I think the courts have been clear that you can't own the law. As Carl Malmud, one of the activists, said, I fought the law and the law won. We have to make sure that we do not deny access to the public for the details of this law, as this bill would do. I have no problem with the amendment that has been offered. It simply puts those who are disabled on equal footing with those who are able, denied access to the full elements of the law. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll support the amendment, but I'm speaking to strongly oppose the underlying bill. And in Washington, there's a trick sometimes where people name a bill the exact opposite of what it does. Like the Fiscal Responsibility Act was very fiscally irresponsible. And in this case, we have the Protecting and Enhancing Public Access to Codes Act. But what the bill actually does is limit public access to codes. And so for folks watching at home who view this as like a highly technical debate, here's the essence of what we're discussing. That which has the force of law, some of us believe you shouldn't be able to limit the distribution of based on what you're willing to pay for it. You should never have to rent the law. You should be able to get the law for free all the time. And everything that has the force of law, including many of these regulations. Now, I would have thought it would have been a sweet enough deal for those who get their novel concept included into a code or a regulation to have their novel concept in that code or regulation. Oftentimes, when in Florida, for example, in building codes, someone will create a better hurricane tie-down. And if they get the code to reflect a requirement for that tie-down, they're gonna do very well. But apparently, that's not good enough, because now, if this bill were to become law, then if someone wanted to repackage and publish do-it-yourself publications that included that information, they would have to go and pay to republish that which is the law. There is a reason this bill has been on this agenda in this committee for week after week, and it is not passed, because a bunch of us just are totally bamboozled by the concept that you would ever set something up like this. And the reason we are taking it up in the Judiciary Committee is because the people who have wanted to rent the law previously keep losing in court. Time after time, they lose in court when they try to make you rent the law, and so now they're trying to get us to change it so that they can do it. This is bad for do-it-yourselfers, it's bad for regular folks, and it's good for special interests. And I'm not going to vote for the bill, and I'm probably going to support this amendment and many others. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes in opposition, or in response to some of the things that have been said. And I'd like to place in the record a copy of the information gleaned from Ms. Lofgren's website, and I'll read just a small portion of it. In common with other websites, log files are stored on the web server, saving details such as visitor's IP address, browser type, referring page, and visits. Cookies may be used to remember visitors' preferences when interfacing with the website. Where registration is required, visitors' email and username will be stored on the server. In addition, it refers to Google Dart ads. I also would place in the record from the Democratic National Committee, by assessing and using services, you agree to the terms, you do not agree to the terms, you do not use the services. Ownership is expressly retained by the Democratic National Committee, and I'm going through a lot of the other prohibitions and leaving those alone. However, it also closes by saying, to the fullest extent permitted by applicable laws, you will defend, indemnify, and hold harmless the DNC and its officers, directors, employees, volunteers, and agents. And oh, by the way, this will be under the auspices of the District of Columbia. Without objection, they'll be placed in the record. There was nothing nefarious in what the gentlelady read, even though we could all say that it could be made simpler. And as we saw earlier, the bill now requires that personally identifiable information not be used without consent, including to sell. That means that if the person does not consent, they still get into the website. They do not have to consent to their email being used or sold. The fact is, we understand that there are people who would like this for free. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of people who would like this copyrighted material for free. These tens of thousands of pages of various standards are the result of hard work. The gentleman from Florida was correct. On occasion, somebody helps get a standard in that looks like their patented product. But let's remember two things. Patented product expires in a relatively short period of time, and almost without fail, these standards are not related to a specific product and cannot be identified as a specific product. However, to the extent that they are, it becomes a standard essential patent, and they do not get the revenue they'd like to receive. Instead, anyone can use their patent to make a similar product. We on this committee have this bill before us because we have a constitutional obligation, an inherent basic Article 1 obligation to promote the useful creations. We have been doing that since our founding. These works, these copyrighted materials are no exception. What we are doing here today, and what the title of the bill implies, because it is, we are taking away some of the ordinary rights that copywriters have. We're requiring that they give away for free and make it searchable. We're requiring that they make access available at their expense to the blind, to the deaf, and the like, and they will have to do that at their expense. Not at the expense of a specific city who's actually adopted these regulations, but the standard-setting organizations. That's a burden on the private sector, a burden on the copyright holder that is not routine. So let's understand one thing. We are taking from the copyright holder here today in order to ensure that these standards continue to get produced, if possible, at no cost to the public, but with full available to the public. And that availability to the public is important. Lastly, the gentlelady was right. The state of California adopts a lot of standards and sets some of their own, makes them up, no question at all. But again, if you want to do some work in your house and you want to do it not according to the code, you do so at your own peril. You don't actually have to do it according to these standards. These standards exist for safety. And the people who would next buy your house, or the people who come to your house, or the people that just simply pass by your house rely on these standards of safety to reduce the chances of electrocution, of burning, of all kinds of other loss. And that's what we're here to preserve here today. And I yield back. Who seeks recognition? Seeing no others. The question occurs on the The question occurs on the amendment offered from the gentlelady from North Carolina. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the
I
ayes
ask
have.
for a recorded vote.
A gentlelady requests a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Issa?
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes aye. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Klein? Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes aye. Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Nagoose? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye. Mr. Schiff, you're not recorded. Mr. Schiff votes aye. Mr. Van Drew, you are not recorded. Mr. Van Drew votes aye.
Mr. Gooden?
Mr. Gooden votes aye.
Mr. Klein?
Mr. Klein? Yes. Mr. Klein votes yes.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 15 ayes and 0 noes.
The ayes have it. The amendment is adopted. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
And a lady from California. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1631 offered by Ms. Lofgren of California. Strike page 7, line 4, and all that follows through page 9, line 2, and insert the following. B, standards incorporated by reference, any standard or any specific portion of a standard incorporated.
Gentleman reserves a point of order. The amendment Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read. Gentlelady from California is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment establishes that standards incorporated by reference into the law are not subject to copyright protection. Now, this is rooted in the principle of public access to the law, which is a cornerstone of our U.S. legal system. The amendment guarantees that every individual has the unimpeded right to access, comprehend, follow, and communicate the laws that govern them. Now, the U.S. judicial system has consistently upheld the principle that standards incorporated into law must be readily accessible to the public, free from copyright restrictions. This amendment would codify that established judicial precedent. Now, I submitted an amicus brief, several actually, supporting the Public Resource Org, known as PRO, when they were sued by the American Society for Testing, that's ASTM, in 2017. In that case, ASTM sued PRO for providing free access to safety codes online, codes which were integrated into law by reference. Now, the D.C. Circuit found in favor of PRO, noting the constitutional concerns raised by private ownership of essential legal standards. This ruling was bolstered by a 2020 Supreme Court judgment, Georgia versus Public Resource Org, which affirmed that no one can own the law. I think it's important to note that the manager's amendment really does not resolve that underlying problem with this bill. It is true that the manager's amendment says you have to affirmatively agree to give up your personal information. What it doesn't say is that you get access to the law unless you do so. So, I mean, it's form over policy and doesn't really resolve the problem. Many people, including activists from both the right and the left, have been very vocal in understanding and emphasizing that the idea that you could condition access, full access to the law, either through giving up your information, by money, to allowing advertising and tracking, is inconsistent with our proud history as a democracy and a republic. I would note, and I would ask unanimous consent to put into the record a letter in opposition to the bill signed by a variety of individuals and groups, including the Authors Alliance, the Center for Democracy and Technology, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, Fight for the Future, Repair.org, which is something interesting because I think we have agreed on both sides of the aisle the need to get access for repair purposes, Public Citizen, Public Knowledge, and a variety of others. I do think it's important that we adopt this amendment. The direction we're taking, as the gentleman from Florida said earlier, is in completely the wrong direction. I would note, and I will have other amendments about this later, that the idea that these nonprofits are somehow profiting by the public service they are providing by posting these laws is not correct. If you go to the Public Resource Org, you won't find advertising as been suggested here at this podium. It is a public service that that nonprofit provides. The concern that these standard-setting organizations would not proceed is simply not supported by the facts. They lost, as Mr. Gates had said, they've lost repeatedly in court, and they haven't stopped developing standards. They make a lot of money, and I will have an amendment about that later in this markup. But I do think, just to lay it out, we need to adopt this amendment that I have offered. It makes sure that the fair use protections are enshrined in law, and I hope that the members will vote in favor. I yield back.
Without objection, the letter will be included. I will yield myself an amendment, comment on the amendment. When folks across Wisconsin go to bed tonight, they feel protected from electrical, fire hazards because of standard development by experts across these fields. These standards development organizations, or SDOs, convene experts across industry to develop and publish a variety of technical and other important safety standards for use by both public and private sector, all at no cost to the taxpayers. However, federal courts have endangered these organizations' copyright protections by ruling that SDOs lose the benefit of copyright for their safety standards when they are incorporated by reference into law by federal, state, and local governments. This puts the public use of these important standards in jeopardy. H.R. 1631 makes a small but important clarification by stating that SDOs retain copyright protection when a standard is incorporated into law or regulation, provided that a standard is available for free viewing on a publicly accessible website. This bill strikes a balance between the needs of the public and the needs of the copyright owner. Importantly, this bill does not preclude SDOs from licensing copyrights on their standards, which are necessary to support the organization's standards development activities. Next, who seeks recognition? The gentlelady from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to speak on the amendment. So I'm speaking in opposition to this amendment, and I just want to be very clear, and I want to thank Representative Lofgren for her perspective and the energy and intellect that she brings to this issue and so many. I have the great fortune of serving with her on 2 committees, and we agree on almost everything. So I'm almost shocked that we don't agree on this very issue. But for me, it comes down to this, and this amendment really gets to the heart of it. Once someone has received a copyright, and let's just remember, getting a copyright is something that is enshrined in our Constitution, they then own a property right. Now, if the government wants to take or use someone's property, say to build a road or to have a right-of-way, they compensate that person for it, even if it's for a short period of time. And I've done a lot of eminent domain work in my life, and that's the way it works. But a copyright, again, is a property right, one that is recognized in our Constitution. And so if the government makes something that is copyrighted something that is part of the law, there needs to be some kind of fair compensation. Now, the last time I looked at this, I was a state legislator and we did these kinds of codes, the government doesn't give any compensation for this kind of work. And instead, what this bill is doing is saying, well, we just need to make the money to be able to do this and provide this public service, but we will give this to the public for free and make sure it's accessible. We are proud of our work and we want to share it. However, we cannot share it in a way that others can manipulate it, others can monetize it, which distinguishes this from fair use. Fair use does not allow other people to monetize things. If this amendment is allowed, not only do you not get your copyright, but somebody else can use your work and turn it into something else and make money off of it. And so this amendment, while well-intentioned, really turns our Constitution, our property rights, and the incentives completely upside down. And for that reason, I must oppose this amendment despite my great admiration for Ms. Lofgren. And I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Move the strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to associate myself with the comments of the gentlelady from North Carolina. I think this is an important piece of legislation. As was said, incorporating technical and voluntary consensus standards developed by SDOs allow lawmakers to take advantage of the specialized expertise of these organizations and it costs money, so these SDOs have supported themselves in their standards development activities by selling subscriptions or copies of these standards, including those referenced in laws or regulations. And without that stream, many would not be able to continue their efforts. So this bill to allow SDOs to retain copyright protection on their standards while also requiring them to make the incorporated portions publicly available online at no monetary cost is an important step forward. I support the bill. I oppose the amendment on that basis, and with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chairman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I too oppose this amendment because it would truly turn upside down the intent of the bill. There's no question at all. If you simply say if standards incorporated by reference will be taken to zero, here's what's going to happen. You won't have these standards being produced. Now, there are alternate models, and maybe the gentlelady from California has a point. Maybe every city and every state should simply buy the rights to put it on their website, buy the right to do it. But if you buy the right to distribute it as and have this work done for a city or a state, I can tell you what's going to happen. They'll add it to your permit cost, and your permit cost will skyrocket. There's no question at all, you have to pay for what you get, and nothing is for free. I also want to include in the record a statement by the Copyright Alliance, or a letter to both the chairman and ranking member supporting our legislation, in addition to, I'd also, unanimous consent, that be placed in the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Additionally, I ask unanimous consent that a letter from 16 SDOs supporting the bill be placed in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Lastly, I want us all to understand on both sides of this, this is not unique. It seems to be unique and complicated because the books are long, thousands of pages between the various standards. But let's make it simpler. We all went to college. We all were required to buy books in order to take a college course. We did not get, oh, that book will be made free to you, at least at the universities I attended. We didn't get to keep the book. We didn't get to reuse the book. We didn't get to monetize or sell it to somebody else. And God knows, half of them were written by the professors I actually was going in front of. It is not uncommon for people to say, boy, I'd sure like to have that, the 12 books I had to buy this semester for free because it was $1,000 or more today. But the fact is, we in America have believed in intellectual property, of patents, of copyrights, of trademarks, and we do not take that easily. And the gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Dean, said it very well. We, in fact, are taking from these people. It's a partial taking. If we take it all, we have no choice but to pay for it, or it won't be produced. And if it's not produced, the safety of Americans will be diminished dramatically. In closing, I'd just like to read something so that people have a feel for what is in fact 1,000 pages. But I'm just going to give you one very boring part, but it's important in a way. It has to do, it's a subset of appliances in the home, and it says, for example, in 422.16, general, flexible coverage shall be permitted for the connection of appliances to facilitate their frequent interchange and to prevent the transmission of noise and vibration, or 2, to facilitate the removal and disconnect of appliances that are fastened in place where the fastening means and mechanical connections are specifically designed to permit ready removal for maintenance and repair of the appliances. Now, they're talking about, various products, including the home vacuum. Boy, that's boring, and it's long. It's not really a law the way we think of as laws. It is detailed guidance to the people who, in fact, are putting products into your home, wiring into your home, plumbing into your home. There's a reason that we don't incorporate this as specifically as a law. We don't write a law that says that Because the first thing that would happen is people would say, well, that's guidance and there's some flexibility there, so how do we enforce the law? The answer is, this is guidance, this is education. These books, in fact, educate people, including people like my good friend from Kentucky, Mr. Massey. Okay, when you seek to build your own house as a do-it-yourselfer, or for that matter, a chicken coop that moves automatically, you look to these kinds of books for guidance, and you say, oh, you know, I may or may not do it exactly this way, but I'm darn well going to look and see what somebody else thinks is the right way and build it as well as I can. And therefore, I oppose the amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the amendment. You know, these standards developing organizations perform a public service that keeps Americans safe, keeps consumers, keeps workers safe. And they do it voluntarily in a nonprofit format. Industry leaders get together, appoint persons to come up with standards that govern their industries. This is and the reason why they do that is to protect public health and to create uniformity so business can proceed efficiently. There can be interoperability, there can be all kinds of things that make profits ensue from a certain practice. And so these standards developing organizations do this. It's kind of like a public-private partnership because their level of expertise exceeds that of elected officials in state government, state legislatures, county commissions, city councils. They don't have the expertise to develop these standards and best practices, but these nonprofit groups operating for the public good as well as for the benefit of the businesses that they come from, public-private partnership, they perform a good public service. Now, we've relied on these codes that have been adopted by government for centuries. We've relied on these to keep us safe and to keep things moving forward efficiently. And but now we have, it's kind of like, if it's not broke, don't fix it. We have a situation in place where these standards developing organizations have been operating, but now the threat is to their revenue stream because, of course, they can't do this for free. They don't do it for profit, they do it nonprofit, but they can't do it for free. There has to be some revenue stream available to them to continue to protect the health, safety, and well-being of Americans through their work. And this legislation offers that, ability while making sure that the information that they produce is accessible to the public for free. And so I think that we're protecting copyrights by making sure that their copyrights on their material that they produce is meaningful in that they get to at least recoup their expenses and be able to prepare for the next round of updates to the codes that then our governments adopt by reference to protect Americans. So I support the legislation, and I believe that this amendment would gut the legislation, which is why I oppose the amendment, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. We now go to the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Massey.
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Speaking in support of the Lofgren amendment, you know, and I associate myself with her remarks and those of Matt Gaetz earlier. And we're talking about unfettered, whether people should have unfettered access to the law that governs their lives. I mean, if you're going to build a deck on your house and somebody may show up with a gun and say, take the deck down, you didn't build it according to the law, then the person building the deck should have unfettered access to that information. But I ran into another circumstance. I think this bill, the underlying bill, may affect more than we realize. I set out to buy an air conditioner a few weeks ago, a mini split, okay? And they've got these little orange yellow stickers that give you the energy efficiency of it. And they've reduced it down to one number, but we know life isn't just one number. So there's something called the energy efficiency ratio, the EER. If it's 95 degrees outside and it's 80 degrees in your house, what is the ratio of BTUs per watt? That is what the EER is. And some smart people in the government said, well, we shouldn't just regulate these appliances based on the EER because it's not always 95 degrees out or 80 degrees in your house. So they came up with the SEER, the seasonal energy efficiency ratio. And they did that in 2016, but in 2023, they said, well, the manufacturers are kind of cheating and they're doing the specs according to how this is how we calculated it. So now we need an SEER2, a SEER2. It's a better representation of the energy efficiency of this appliance. And I've got a spreadsheet of 10 of these air conditioners on my computer like any good engineer would have before they go to Lowe's or Home Depot. And I thought to myself, well, how do they calculate the SEER2? Because if this is the number that's going to decide which air conditioner I buy, because I want to be as energy efficient as possible. I'm using solar panels to run everything in my house. I got to be super energy efficient. So I go to see how they calculate the SEER2 rating for air conditioners. It turns out it's rulemaking from one of the agencies. And I'm like, well, heck, I serve in Congress. I know about rulemaking. Let me go pull the rule. So I pull the rule. It's 500 pages, okay? The notice and comment and rulemaking. And I get down in there. I'm like, somewhere in here, because they're regulating the air conditioning manufacturers, somewhere in this 500 pages, they're going to tell me how they calculate the seasonal energy efficiency ratio now. And I get down in there, and it says, go to this website. In the rule, which is now law, it's got a hyperlink to a third-party website. And I click on it. And because I'm not a member of that organization, I can't even know how they're calculating the energy efficiency of an air conditioner. It's super secret. I'm not supposed to know. Just take our word for it, look at the orange sticker at Lowe's and see what the number says and go off of that. Well, what if I want to know how that number was calculated? What if I don't live in the same climate where they calculated that number? What if I want to know how that air conditioner will work in my area? I can't know without paying money to the
gentleman
website.
yield?
I would love to yield.
Then vote for the bill, because we're going to mandate that. We're going to mandate that be open and transparent and searchable.
Well, I hope the gentleman will vote for my amendment because I don't think I have to agree to their terms and conditions, and I'll yield to Ms. Lofgren.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I think your example clearly outlines the problem, and I appreciate that you did it in a real-life way, that you should not be able to own the laws of private party. The chairman said, he didn't always want to buy the books in college. Well, I didn't either. But the difference is the professor can't charge you with a crime for not living up to something that's in that book. The law has the full force of the government. And as the courts have found, you can't hold the people accountable to the law if you can't give them full access to the law, which is exactly what you've said. Thank you, Mr.
So reclaiming my time, just in that specific example, I'm showing that the laws that regulate air conditioners, you not only affect the air conditioner manufacturers, okay, the fact that you can't have unfettered access to it, it affects the consumers who want to buy an air conditioner that is built according to that law. Well, I can't even know what law it's built according to right now, and I don't think I should have to join some group or agree to some terms or give up my cookies or let the building inspector know that I'm thinking about putting an air conditioner on my house, because they'll be trolling this data too. And I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Real quickly, a couple points. One, when I got here, I didn't know how I was going to vote on this bill. Hearing the argument and debate, which has been good, and I respect both sides, I associate myself with Mr. Rice's bill and am in opposition to this amendment. We want to incentivize, and it is not an incentive to find out all your hard work is going to go to naught. So while something should be publicly available, and in essence is a taking by the government, you also should be able to get what is due to you. Secondly, if I ever buy an air conditioner, I am definitely going to associate myself with Mr. Massey and ask him for some advice. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no? No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I'd ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Spartz? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Klein? No. Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? No. Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? No. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Schiff? No. Mr. Schiff votes no. Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Nagoose? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Mr. Ivy votes no. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye.
The clerk will report. Wait a second. Have all members who want to vote voted? Anyone intend to change their vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 3 ayes and 15 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentlelady from California.
I have an amendment after this.
The clerk will report. Gentleman reserves.
Amendment to H.R. 1631 offered by Ms. Lofgren of California.
The amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlelady from California is recognized to explain her amendment.
This amendment declares that standards incorporated by reference under the law are fair use. The amendment does simply codify the court precedent. The Pro Codes Act goes against judicial precedent that have been powerfully reaffirmed in the past few years. In ASTM versus Public Resource, that was a D.C. Circuit Court decision in 2023, the court held that online posting by Public Resource of hundreds of technical standards, such as building and safety codes that were incorporated by reference into federal and state law, is protected fair use, not subject to copyright infringement claims. The lower decision on ASTM versus Pro focused on whether copyright's fair use doctrine permits public access groups to make IBR standards available online. Similarly, the court ruled against SDO's copyright infringement claims mainly on fair use grounds. The court, in analyzing the fair use factors as applied to Pro's distribution, said this: in many cases, it may be fair use for PRO to reproduce part or all of the technical standards in order to inform the public about the law. Here's what Judge Katsas said in his concurring opinion. It's a matter of common sense. Access to the law cannot be conditioned on the consent of a private party. He cited Boca and Veek, and he argued that the result is not just fair use, but may also be based on First Amendment and due process clause doctrines. In the Veek versus Southern Building Code Congress International, the en banc ruling asserted that as law, the model codes enter the public domain and are not subject to the copyright holder's exclusive prerogatives. This case provides strong precedent for the public domain status of laws, including those derived from private standards. In Georgia versus Public Resource Org, that's a 2020 case, the Supreme Court addressed the issue of copyright protection for non-binding annotations in the official code of Georgia, and it reaffirmed a precedent that when officials are empowered to speak with the force of law, they create materials in the course of their official duties. Those materials are government edicts that cannot be copyright protected. Now, the enactment of this bill, if we do make the mistake of enacting it, may still may still open up attacks from civil society trying to make sure that the law is freely available, because clearly, if you're going to be charged with violating a law, but you can't be granted access to the law, there are due process clause provisions there, and there may also be First Amendment issues in that problem. I note, a lot of concern has been expressed about whether these standard-setting organizations would proceed if information was freely available. It's worth noting that this premise has no basis in fact. In ASTM versus Public Resource Org, the DC Circuit found that although the Public Resource Org had been posting incorporated standards for 15 years, the plaintiffs, and this is a quote by the court, the plaintiffs have been unable to produce any economic analysis showing the public resources activities have harmed any relevant market for their standards. To the contrary, ASTM sales have increased over that time. The court explained that because governments did not update their regulations incorporating standards as frequently as SDOs update their standards, industry players continue to license the standards even before their adoption as law to keep current. The SDO also derives significant revenue from selling training materials and programs. It's clear that the SDOs do not need copyright incentive. The development of standards advances the economic interests of their members. And I think it's just worth noting, since PRO posted for 15 years standards until they were sued and the courts found in their favor, and it did not deter these organizations from developing standards. The concern that they would not develop standards is obviously misplaced by the record and by the facts. This amendment should be adopted to make sure that that access is preserved, and I see my time has expired. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Recognize the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be very brief. I support this bill for all the reasons I talked about before. And I just want to note the uniqueness of the argument for this amendment by the gentlelady. She states that this legislation violates lots of court precedents. It does. I always thought the purpose of legislation was to change the law. Now, the court precedents state the law as it exists now. The purpose of the legislation is to change the law because we think the law needs to be changed. And therefore, I support the bill and I oppose the amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
I've yielded back.
I'll strike the last word myself and yield to the lady.
Just briefly, I understand that Congress has a role of enacting the law, but in the court cases at issue here, it's not just a determination of the law, that the Congress has passed. It's an interpretation of the constitutional limits to what legislators can enact, and that the enactment of copyright protection for the law would violate not only fair use, which is a court doctrine, but possibly also the Due Process Clause as well as the First Amendment. So it's not as if we've got a law that is being changed. We can't change the Constitution through legislation, and that really is the bottom line of what's at stake here. And with that, I thank the gentleman and yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. And in response to that, the gentlelady couldn't be more right. We cannot change the Constitution. We have an obligation to provide for creations, useful creations of art and science for a limited period of time. That's what a copyright is. So we have an obligation. Additionally, we have a doctrine of fair use. A doctrine is, in fact, generally accepted court doctrine. We are acutely aware that the two do fall against each other, but we've struck a compromise here. The compromise is, in fact, you can go to the website if this bill when this bill becomes law, and you can, in fact, get your fair use. You can get all the fair use you want. You'll be able to search for and read any and all of the rules and laws that might help you in making a decision on everything, including what air conditioner to buy. We want to make sure that's there. We've decided that that is a reasonable burden to put on these SDOs, not to their complete acceptance, but to their compromise. So I think it is important that we have respected the court doctrine of sometimes there's fair use. In general, fair use, though, is a snippet of a creation, a pulling of a creation for purposes of education. Fair use has not been so broadly accepted before, but we're willing to go with it. We know this will stand the test of court challenge because, in fact, everyone has access to the law. I might note something for everyone. It's just a small piece of education. There's a lot of other laws. And where do you get those laws? Well, I'll tell you, for lawyers, they go to LexisNexis. They get case law, they get all kinds of material, and they pay for it. The fact that you have laws, but in fact you have enhanced ability to see or to work with it, and that you pay a service for it is not new. The real question is, will the service be provided by the copyright holder, or will, in fact, anyone be able to say, well, it's in the public domain, so now I'm going to monetize somebody else's hard work and creation. That's why we've struck the balance that there will be fair use, there will be availability according to this. And yes, we've also protected people's personal rights. Your email will not be able to be used or sold. Your likeness or your other information provided will not be able to be used or sold because we don't believe fair use access should in fact be per se monetized. However, as I said earlier, almost everybody wants to collect some things, including things that help them protect their website from being attacked. And with that, I yield back. And does anyone else seek recognition on this amendment? Seeing no others, the question is on the amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it.
I'd ask for a recorded vote.
I had no doubt. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Benz? Mr. Benz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Mr. Kiley votes no. Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler? No. Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Escobar votes no. Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Mr. Ivy votes no. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye.
No?
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no.
The clerk will report. Does anyone else seek to vote? The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 2 ayes and 13 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Who seeks recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Would the gentlelady yield for a colloquy briefly?
Of course.
Since I've noted that gentlelady has some 50 amendments, and many of them are substantially similar, would the gentlelady consider en bloc of some of her amendments, if not this one, in the future?
I'm always open to discussion, Mr. Chairman. This one is different than the others.
Absolutely, and we want to give fair consideration. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1631, offered by Ms. Lofgren of California. Strike the word "not" from page 7, line 22.
The amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment is simple and I think important. The Pro Codes Act amendment serves as a safeguard against potential barriers to public access to legal materials. Even with the adjustment in the underlying bill requiring a affirmative consent, it does not provide for access to the material unless you give affirmative consent. Under the bill, the standard development organizations could impose conditions such as requiring users to create accounts, which they do today, agree to restrictive terms of service in order to access essential legal information online. These conditions greatly limit important activities like distribution, sharing, or printing of the content. This amendment would prevent such constraints, ensuring that no one is required to sacrifice their personal data or to agree to burdensome terms to access the law. Now, by doing so, we withhold the fundamental principle that laws should be freely accessible to all without undue restrictions. I would note that the gentleman's example of LexisNexis proves the point in a way. LexisNexis charges because they annotate the law. They've provided cases and analysis. They aren't the law, they're the analysis of the law. Now, you can get the US Code online without giving up your email address, without agreeing to abide by the laws of Pennsylvania wherever you live, to agree to allow cookies to follow you and provide ads as a service to you. That is something that should not be a condition of finding out what the law is, just as it is not for finding out what the U.S. Code is in general. Now, it's important that, and I'll just mention the NAACP submitted what I thought was a very effective amicus brief on this subject. They basically said, and here's a quote on page 2 of their amicus, "Equal access to the law is fundamental to a just society, and the technical standards at issue are essential sources of law that regulate health and safety in countless domains." The court agreed with them and protected free and equitable access to these standards because they're government edicts and it's fair use to learn it. The idea that we would have to condition the release of personal information to find out the fulsome nature of the law that could be used to prosecute us is, I think, it's unfathomable to me. Honestly, I serve with members of this committee. We agree sometimes, we disagree sometimes, but I think when the court said that the law has to be free and that this committee would say otherwise, to me, it's inexplicable, frankly. I'm at a loss to understand how we could find other than what the court has done. I understand there are concerns about the financial viability of these standard-setting organizations. Believe me, they have made a lot of money since Pro posted all of the regulations online, and they will continue to make a lot of money. This is America. I'm for people making a profit, even the nonprofits. I have nothing against the standard-setting organizations at all. They provide a good service, usually in conjunction with governmental entities, in collaboration with governments. That is a different proposition than saying Americans should be required to give up their personal information in order to understand what they are being bound to follow by with the force of law by government. So, Mr. Chairman, this amendment would solve that problem. I hope that it will be supported, and with that, my time is expired, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. I recognize myself in opposition. As I read the amendment, it guts the bill once again. What it basically says is that you can sign up, take no information, pull it all down, and distribute it if this were to pass. I want to note, though, because we've been talking about the Great White Night, publicresource.org. On their website, what I note is publicresource.org collects two types of information about users: the data that user volunteers are using and donating to us, and aggregating tracking data we collect when users interact with us. Additionally, they do require the information, and actually specifically say we analyze visitors, use their sites by tracking information such as page views, traffic flows, search terms, click-throughs, and so on. And then they go on to say they collect cookies in certain circumstances. I think there's a real canard here, and that is that we can make it sound terrible to collect a cookie or to try to improve a website's ability to give you what you want when you go on it, or even to allow you to return to where you last were, as though that is bad. This bill, with its amendments, makes it clear that they cannot monetize people's personal information without their previous support, and we will assume that most will say no, and that's fine. What we're trying to do is, as the gentlelady wants us to do, make all of these laws available in a very usable format while maintaining our constitutional obligation to have those who make these creations, in fact, be able to get some remuneration for them, in this case, to cover these nonprofits' cost. So once again, I, not terribly reluctantly, but reluctantly, do not find this to be an acceptable amendment and oppose it. Does anyone else seek recognition? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it.
I'd ask for a recorded vote, Mr. Chairman.
A recorded vote being ordered, we will call the roll. Clerk, call the roll.
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Nels? Oh, Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Mr. Ivy votes no. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no.
Does anyone else wish to vote? Does anyone want to change their vote? The clerk will call the roll. Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 2 ayes and 14 noes.
Then the amendment is not agreed to. Does the gentlelady have hopefully a gaggle of these?
I have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 4.
The gentlelady has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will report.
Amendment to H.R. 1631 offered by Ms. Lofgren of California. Strike lines 13 through 14.
The amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to note that on Wednesday, September 27th, last year at 10 o'clock in the morning, the Copyright Office had a hearing, the oversight of the U.S. Copyright Office. And here's what the Register Perlmutter said, and I quote, "The public should have access to standards when they are incorporated into the law because the public does have the right of access to the law. While the standards themselves may be protected by copyright, the use of them generally falls under fair use, as it is for the purposes of understanding, using, and applying the law." So at present, we think the courts are handling this in an appropriate way. This amendment not only makes sure that the information is available, it makes sure that you can actually utilize the information. As I mentioned earlier in my earlier in the statement, the amendment that in the manager's amendment that allows for searchable of the index really doesn't deal with the problems with these user rooms that are offered up as a SOP to the public. If there's no going back on these rooms, and so if you go to a blank page, you can't actually search what's in the law as incorporated by reference, and therefore it's really not usable. This amendment fixes the definition of publicly accessible online to ensure that the public can fully engage with and utilize the law, especially standards incorporated by reference. This amendment underscores the need for material to be easily available, to be searchable, linkable, and copyable, enhancing its practical utility for the general public. Well, you know, speed sometimes matters. Quoting again from the NAACP's amicus brief, they mention that standards provide access to legal information that they believe is critical for tenants seeking to assert their rights. And here's what they said: to mount a defense against unjust eviction, tenants must act quickly. And that means you have to be able to access this information in an accessible way. In South Carolina, where the NAACP launched its Housing Navigator program, tenants have just 10 days from receiving the landlord's written notice of eviction to file a request for a hearing in which they may alert the court to housing code violations or uninhabitable conditions. At that hearing, tenants and the NAACP volunteers who advise them urgently need access to all relevant information, including technical standards that concern water, heating, fire safety, asbestos, and more. During these stressful, and this is the NAACP again, and often traumatic moments, the last thing tenants need to worry about is copyright law. I would note that, as Mr. Massey mentioned, you can go to a link that gets you standards that you can't find out about, but if you were able to get to the link, often those go to other links because there's a plethora of standards that are being developed that have the force of law. I give a lot of credit to those in the private sector who are developing these standards. They do a good thing. I do not object to what they're doing. However, they are making plenty of money, and to restrict access to the standards that have been adopted as force of law is not consistent. It's not consistent with the history of this country. It's not consistent with fair use doctrine, as the Registrar of Copyright has noted. It's not consistent with the First Amendment, and it's not consistent with due process. So, Mr. Chairman, I think this amendment would help. Obviously, the underlying bill still has a very large number of problems, but this amendment would help fix them, and I urge its adoption, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Does anyone seek recognition? Seeing none, I oppose the amendment, and the clerk will call the roll. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. All those in favor say aye. Those opposed, nay.
No.
The opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it.
I'd
The
ask
amendment
for
is
a
not
recorded
The
vote,
clerk will
Mr.
call the
Chairman.
roll.
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Spartz? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson-Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Ms. Scanlon votes no. Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Mr. Ivy votes no. Ms. Ballant? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no.
Does anyone else seek recognition? Seek to vote?
Aye. Sorry. Okay? I'm very fair, Mr. Chairman. Shall I offer another amendment? This one is different. They all are different. Mr. Chairman?
The gentlelady, it'll just be another moment. We're in the middle of recording the vote.
Ms. Ballant, you're not recorded. Ms. Ballant votes aye.
The gentlelady votes aye. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 2 ayes and 14 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Does anyone else seek recognition? The gentlelady from California, is this an in block?
No.
Before the clerk reports, I would advise the gentlelady that, like any legislation, we want to have a full hearing. However, the similarity of amendments is such that we will reach a point where we call the previous question. So I would advise the gentlelady to put her most different ones up front if possible. The clerk will report.
Well, I have an amendment at the desk, and it's amendment not number 5, but number 6.
Oh, the clerk will report amendment, or clerk will read Amendment 6.
Amendment to H.R. 1631, offered by Ms. Lofgren of California. Strike, quote, period, quote, from page
The amendment will be
7.
considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes to explain her amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment safeguards the public's ability to freely reproduce the materials without fear of copyright infringement, supporting educational initiatives and grassroots activism. This is an issue I mentioned that the NAACP has highlighted as extremely important as access to standards relating to housing rights. In their brief, they state, quote, without the information contained within the technical standards, Black and low-income communities are fighting blind against landlords and other powerful and well-resourced adversaries for these communities, and access to the standards is access to justice. Now, the issue of potential liability is a big one, especially for the little guy. If you are a little nonprofit, if you are a homeowner, a neighborhood association, and you think you're going to have to pay a lot of money if you access this information freely, that's a real deterrent to access to law. And as I want to go back to the pages that you find if you try and access the law today. Users see that they're being granted a limited license. There's no print, save, or cut and paste options. The user isn't allowed to download, reproduce, store in a retrieval system, modify, or make available any of the standards. So essentially, you're unable to debate them as part of the public. Further, if you scroll down, the user is informed that if any legal jurisdiction somehow disallows any of the provision of the contract one is agreeing to, the license to use the site is revoked, and the user also gives up almost all judicial review rights should somehow the contract be deemed contrary to law. The user also agrees to indemnify ASTM, including paying attorney's fees, and there are several disclaimers of warranty, but there are additional problems. The user has to agree that the laws of Pennsylvania will govern your actions no matter where you are. We should be standing up for the little guy here in the Congress. We should be standing up for those who need the full right of access to information and to the law. That's what the amicus brief by the NAACP argued. I recommend it to all, and I would ask, Mr. Chairman, actually, if I could make a part of the record by unanimous consent, the amicus brief filed by the NAACP.
Without objection,
on
it'll be
this-
included in the record.
This subject. I do think this committee appears to be on the wrong track, but certainly removing the deterrent, the financial doomsday, if you will, for little people trying to access this information is a step we ought to take further, especially in view of the statement made by the registrar that the public should have access and that the courts have interpreted the law correctly and in an appropriate way. Mr. Chairman, I'm not going to use my full 5 minutes. That's my point of view, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields. Anyone seek recognition? Seeing none, I would ask unanimous consent to place in the record a paper from the Fire Service Support for the Pro Codes Act, in which 12 organizations, fire service organizations, support the Pro Codes Act. Without objection, to be placed in the record. I just want to recognize myself just to make a statement to the gentlelady. I know you have additional amendments, and I know that one of the themes that I've heard repeatedly is a concern that you wouldn't be able to take a screenshot or in some other way preserve incremental pieces. Current websites, regularly you either do a Control-P or some other keystroke, or take a picture with your phone. Having said that, if the gentlelady's concern at the end of today's markup remains, I would be happy to work on language between now and the floor that would make it clear that for purposes of adjudication, arguments with the court or your city or any other agency, for a non-commercial use, the user should be able to capture that. I believe strongly that the gentlelady has made a good point, although none of her amendments are as narrow as that. So I offer that, even if it's not in one of your amendments, that we would, both the co-sponsor and myself would work with you on that. And with that, does anyone else seek recognition? Seeing none, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Does anyone else seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentlelady has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will read.
Number 7.
Number 7, the clerk will report.
Amendment to H.R. 1631 offered by Ms. Lofgren of California. Strike quote, period, quote from page 7, line 17.
The clerk will suspend, and the gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment as they distribute copies of it.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment bars websites from requiring user registration or agreement to restrictive terms of use, protecting users' personal information and ensuring unhindered access to the law. Overall, it emphasizes the necessity of maintaining the law as a public resource, fully accessible and usable by all. The chairman has mentioned that, for example, the websites that are hosted by the House of Representatives has various cookies involved. I was actually not aware of that, but it's not access to the law that is being constrained. This is a special provision, a special situation where someone has to identify themselves in order to actually access the law that governs them. I mean, as Mr. Massey said, he might not want the government to know that he's looking at a particular standard. Why should you have to give up your personal identity in order to know what the law is? That's inconsistent with a free society. This amendment would resolve that. The chairman, in his manager's amendment, sought to reassure us, I think, that this was solved because there is affirmative consent. Well, yeah, But if you don't consent, you don't get access, as the amendment is stated. Now, if that's not correct, he should support this amendment because it basically says you can't require the personal information, you can't require restriction, registration, and the like in order to access what the law is that governs you. I think that this amendment should be adopted. It's completely inconsistent with a free society that you should have to identify yourself in order to find out what the law is. And I would hope that we would adopt this amendment. I see Mr. Klein wants to say something. I'd be happy to yield to him.
Gentlelady yield, thank you. I just want to express my sympathies with her argument about identification. I see your amendment goes quite a bit further, so the initial part of it interests me, but once you get past identifying information, I'm going to have to oppose the amendment.
Reclaiming my time, the amendment itself does not require registration or requirements to provide name, address, phone number, email address, or any other identifying information, and the website does not require consent to terms of use, form selection clauses, consent to court jurisdiction, waiver of fair use and other defenses, or agreement that any entity owns copyright over materials or text incorporated by reference. If the gentleman would be supportive of the amendment, I would ask unanimous consent to strike the words after the semicolon identifying information.
What I would say to the gentlelady is that if you believe that our requirement, as we did it, where you could opt out of giving information, in other words, non-consent as to your identity, did not go far enough, we would be happy to work on clarifying language, preserving someone's ability to say no to the identity, including if they don't give their email, they simply don't have a contact email. We'd be happy to do that. We cannot, I believe in good conscience, say that you shouldn't, that you would have to give up your copyright and other materials.
Well,
but
I'm suggesting, Mr. Chairman, if I may, the website does not require registration or requirements to provide name, address, phone number, email address, or any other identifying information, period. The other provisions relating to form selection alike, we might make for another amendment, but this would just be the personally identifying information.
Right, and this is what the Fry Amendment does. If you want to work on further clarification with Mr. Fry, we will support anything that clarifies that you can opt out pursuant to the Fry Amendment and still get the information. That's what makes it publicly available. You cannot opt out of copyright recognition because we don't want to have somebody simply download all the information and go monetize it. But again, if the gentlelady's...
Reclaiming my time, I mean, that is, if I may, Mr. Chairman, a little rich. I mean, who's monetizing the information are the standard setting organizations. They're making quite a bit of money by setting these standards. The nonprofits that are posting them are not. So I do think, you know, I oppose this bill, even if this were amendment were included. I think it doesn't solve all the problems in the bill. If the chairman would like to talk to me between now and the floor, assuming the bill is reported out by the committee, I'd be happy to work on his definition. In fact, as written, the manager's amendment does not provide access as a remedy for opting out, and I think that's a major defect. But with that, Mr. Chairman, since we have not reached agreement on a compromise, I would simply hope that the committee would approve this amendment that I have offered. I think it solves a lot of problems. With that, I would...
Would the gentlelady yield?
I would be happy to yield, Mr. Chair.
All right, I just want to make sure. Mr. Klein proposed, and I thought you would agree to striking all the language after the semicolon.
I suggested that as an opportunity, yes.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes. Well, that's her time, but...
Oh, if the gentlelady will yield briefly, I inquired and did indicate the chairman, because it's his bill, had some comments on how they are seeking to address my concerns, and so I'm happy to allow him to continue to work with the gentlelady to try and address those concerns.
Very well. Thank you.
To conserve time, I will yield back, Mr. Chair.
Gentlelady yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? Seeing none, I will rise in opposition to the amendment and call for the vote. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The
I'd
noes
ask for
have
a
it.
recorded vote, Mr. Chair.
And the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Gates. Mr. Biggs. Mr. McClintock. Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Roy. Mr. Bishop. Ms. Sparks. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz. Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Klein. Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong. Mr. Gooden. Mr. Van Drew. Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels. Mr. Moore. Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley. Ms. Hageman. Mr. Moran. Ms. Lee. Mr. Hunt. Mr. Fry. Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler. No. Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu. Ms. Jayapal. Mr. Correa. Ms. Scanlon. Mr. Neguse. Ms. McBath. Ms. Dean. Ms. Escobar. Ms. Ross. Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush. Mr. Ivy. Mr. Ivy votes no. Ms. Ballant.
Mr. Chairman, we have talked here with our mics off, I'm certainly amenable to rolling these votes. That's something the Science Committee does routinely. It's very efficient. I have no objection if that chairman wishes to do that.
Chairman?
Hang on one second.
Ms. Ballant, you're not recorded. Ms. Ballant votes aye.
The clerk will, does anyone else seek to vote? If not, the clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 2 ayes and 13 noes.
And the amendment is not agreed to. The gentlelady from California is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk, amendment number 11.
The clerk will report amendment number, the clerk will read amendment number 11.
Amendment to H.R. 1631 offered by Ms. Lofgren of California strikes line 4 on page 7.
The amendment will consider as read, and the gentlelady from California is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment narrows the definition of SDOs defined under the Act on the basis of revenue and executive pay. There's been some concern expressed in this committee about whether these organizations, struggling as they are, would be able to actually produce if this bill did not pass, despite the fact that they have been producing ever since they lost in court. Some of the larger SDOs, such as ASTM International and the International Organization for Standardization, have very large revenue streams, and of course they are tax-exempt organizations. For example, ASTM reported total revenue of over $100 million for the year ending in 2021, according to their 990. This revenue came from a mix of sources, including the sale of publications, fees for training, certification services, and membership dues. I would note that the total executive compensation for ASTM was $4.5 million. For the American Society of Testing and Materials, the revenue reported for 2021 was $135.7 million, and the executive corporation, total executive corporation, was $4.8 million. The American Society for Testing and Materials, I said that was 2021. The Standards Institute, going back, has consistently been very productive In 2019, their revenue was $81.1 million. Concern has been expressed that somehow they would be deterred by not being able to copyright these laws, but in 2021, their revenue went up to $89.2 million. I don't think we need to worry that these struggling societies are going to somehow fall apart if they're unable to prevent the public from accessing the law. This amendment is carefully crafted so that if there are some little guys who are struggling to develop these standards, they would not be covered. They would get the benefit of the law, and also relates to compensation for executives. If more than 5% of the annual budget was allocated towards executive pay, they also would not be afforded the protection of the act before us. I do think, as I have said several other times, this whole endeavor is flawed from a constitutional point of view, from a First Amendment, from due process, from a fair use point of view. But at least we should make sure that those who have profited greatly through the current scheme are not allowed to continue to prevent the public from accessing the full benefit of the law, and that's why I offer this amendment, Mr. Chairman, and to conserve time, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back.
Oh, with one thing, may I ask unanimous consent to put these financial records into the record?
Sure. Without objection, they'll be entered into the record. I think the sponsor of the legislation and others would be concerned about any type of carve-out and would want the bill to apply consistently across the board for SDOs. And so with that, I would urge opposition to the amendment. Anyone seek recognition? If not, the question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Amendment at the desk, okay. Gentlelady can, clerk will report, excuse me.
Amendment number 12.
The clerk will pass out and
Amendment to HR 1631.
objection. The amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
Mr. Chairman, as it currently stands under the bill, government entities are required to pay substantial amounts to private publishers to obtain copies of the very laws they're responsible for enforcing. Such a situation presents a unique conundrum wherein the supposed owner of the law is required payment from those enforcing it. The amendment tackles this issue head-on by prohibiting standard development organizations which have their standards incorporated into law by reference from charging any form of fee or payment from the government entity that's enforcing that law. This prohibition would apply to federal, state, tribal, local, or territorial governmental entities within the United States, and the amendment explicitly bars SDOs from imposing any charge on these entities for procurement, usage, viewing, downloading, or distributing their own laws or any standards incorporated therein. Now, by curtailing this monetary drain, the amendment seeks to free up funds within the government to allocate resources towards other public services. In essence, it's an initiative to ensure that the accessibility and enforcement of the law are not encumbered by financial transactions with private entities claiming ownership of these laws. I would note that in the EFF amicus brief, which I have asked unanimous consent to put into the record relative to the County of Sonoma,
Without objection.
I quote, "Adoption of privately written text as part of the law leads to an unusual result. private publishers claim that governments charged with enforcing the law must pay them if we want a copy of the very law we're enforcing. The County of Sonoma spends tens of thousands of dollars a year paying publishers for copies of its own laws. During the 2019 cycle, the County of Sonoma spent close to $40,000 on copies of the state model codes. Various copies are required to ensure each enforcing department has a copy, and this is the perverse outcome of claims by private parties to own the law. In their view, even those who enforce the law have to pay to find out what it says. Greater access to copies of the law could permit the county to put some of these funds to other public purposes. I'll just note that I served on the Board of Supervisors for Santa Clara County for 14 years prior to running for Congress. And I know how difficult it is for local governments to meet the various obligations that they have. Every dollar that you spend to pay a private entity to find out what the law you're enforcing is a dollar you don't have to send to the sheriff, to make sure that the health department has what it needs to serve the public, money for parks, money for roads. It's a very limited budget that local governments have, and if they have to pay to find out what the law is that they are trying to enforce, that's money that would go to other worthy causes in the general fund. I think, actually, that this amendment is necessary shows the absurdity of the situation that is supported by the underlying bill. The idea that those who are charged with enforcing the law would have to pay to find out what it is absurd, just as it is absurd for the public to have to pay to find out what they're required to comply with. I would hope, Mr. Chairman, that we would at least approve this provision. It's a modest effort to help our partners at the local and state level. I would note that it would also apply to special districts, which I neglected to mention when I talked about the territorial governments and the tribal governments. So with that, Mr. Chairman, to conserve time, I will yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. Who seeks recognition? The chair is confident that the sponsor of the legislation would oppose this amendment. I think there's potential takings concerns involved. They can always pass a bill that doesn't reference the code. So for those and other concerns, I think he would, Chairman Issa would be opposed to the legislation, and I would urge a no vote. Who seeks recognition? Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from California. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
I would ask for a recorded vote on that, Mr. Chairman.
Recorded vote being requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Gates? Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparks? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Bentz? Mr. Bentz votes no. Mr. Klein? Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes no. Mr. Nadler? No. Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Nagoose? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Ms. Ballant? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Gates, you're recorded as no. Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. McClintock, you're not recorded. Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Issa votes no.
Klein,
Mr. Klein votes no.
gentleman from Georgia? You might,
Mr. Johnson votes no.
okay. Gentleman votes no. The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 3 ayes and 14 noes.
The amendment is not adopted.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentlelady from California is recognized.
I have an amendment at the desk, Amendment number 9.
Clerk will report.
Amendment to HR
Without
1631.
objection, the amendment will be considered as read. The gentlelady from California is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment mandates a study to the cost of governments, a study of the standards cost to governments. It says this: in general, the Comptroller General of the United States shall conduct a study on the financial impact of federal, state, and local governments in the United States associated with acquiring access to standards incorporated by reference into law. That's going to require the total expenditure by government entities for accessing the standards, the financial burdens or resource constraints these costs impose on governments, particularly for smaller municipalities, and evaluate the cost effectiveness of current mechanisms for acquiring these standards. Also, examine the impacts on public services due to the costs associated with accessing these standards. The report would be due not later than 2 years after enactment of the Act, and the Comptroller General would submit the report to Congress, including the findings of the study and recommendations to mitigate any adverse financial impacts identified by the study, including suggestions for legislative or administrative actions as appropriate. I offer this because the prior amendment that I offered that would prohibit charging governments charged with enforcing the law from being made to pay for the law they're enforcing did not succeed. You know, it's noteworthy that the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees Union filed an amicus brief that I would ask unanimous consent to put into the record, Mr.
Without objection.
Chairman. And they say this: they're a labor organization representing the interests of government workers at many levels of government. They note that their members, including corrections officers, emergency service providers, healthcare workers, public worth providers, and the like, maintain our roads, care for the sick and elderly, make our schools good places to learn, keep our communities safe, and much more. This is the other thing that they note. Every member does the important work of our cities and towns, counties, states, schools, correctional, health, and public facilities, and that the union has a strong interest in the case because the members' jobs require that they have access to the information that are incorporated in the standards that are made part of the law and put behind a wall for access. The union notes that without access, they're really dependent on what management might be able to provide to them. They either have to pay up themselves or hope that management has paid up, but in some cases, they point out in their brief, management may not have access to the standards themselves, even if they wanted to share those standards with the workers. Here's what they say on page 3 of their brief. With limited available funds, government employers are faced with a question of priority. Should the safety budget be spent on new safety goggles or on access to the law? Union members have an interest in ensuring that funds are not diverted from safety equipment, from worker compensation or public improvement projects in order to pay for something that should be free to all. I do think, you know, even though we have declined to accept my amendment exempting governments from being charged to learn what they are supposed to enforce, we ought to at least know what the cost is. What is the cost to small towns and counties and tribes and special districts across the United States? by making them pay up to find out what the law is, the law that they're required to enforce. What have they foregone as an expenditure in order to do that? Are they cutting into cops on the street? Or as the AFSCME said, are they cutting into public safety gear in order to find out what the fire standards are? We ought to at least know what the impact is, and that's what this amendment would do. It would require a study of cost to governments for this act. I would hope that we could approve this amendment. We ought to at least know what we've done here. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
If the gentleman would suspend for a moment. If the gentlelady will accept yes for an answer, I too agree that there's no harm in having the General Accountability Office do the study. I might disagree with some of her cost statements and so on, but there's no question at all that we should in fact, anytime we have legislation, include that sort of a question. So if the gentlelady will take yes for an answer, she has it from the author.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Florida, do you still seek recognitions? Does anyone else seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman? Oh, we've
I guess.
adopted, or do
Okay.
we need a formal?
I move the amendment be adopted. All those in favor, aye. Aye. Any opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The ayes have
Mr.
it.
Chairman, I'd ask for a recorded vote.
Yes, sir. A recorded vote on the unanimous vote being asked for. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Issa?
Aye.
Mr. Issa votes aye. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. McClintock votes aye. Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparks? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Bentz? Mr. Klein? Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes yes. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes aye. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Fry votes aye. Mr. Nadler? Yes. Mr. Nadler votes yes. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes aye. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye.
I voted on. Okay.
Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Klein votes yes. Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes aye.
The clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 14 ayes and 1 no.
The amendment is agreed to, and the amendment is passed. For what reason, may I ask, does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report.
It's amendment number 18.
Amendment 18.
And, Mr. Chairman, in answer to your request that we do some en banc, why don't we combine Amendment 13 and Amendment 18 in that they are related?
Without objection, Amendment 13 and 18 will be considered en bloc, and the gentlelady is recognized, oh, no, I'm sorry, and the clerk will read each of them.
Amendment to H.R. 1631, offered by Ms. Lofgren of California, strikes line 7 on page 8 through line 19 on page 8 and inserts the following: standards incorporated by reference into law or regulation, a standard to which copyright protection subsists under section 102A at the time of its fixation shall retain such protection, notwithstanding that the standard is incorporated by reference if the applicable standards.
The clerk will suspend and read the other one.
I don't think that, let's see.
Oh, that's not the right one. What number was that you just read?
18.
18, and then 13 is the other.
Maybe I've missed. Give me just 1 second, Mr. Chairman.
Of course.
The 18 is enforcement. And this isn't it.
Mr. Chairman, do we have any sense of how many more amendments there are?
About 40.
Yeah, but 18
Seriously?
This isn't it.
Thank you, Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, since I think 18, there's been a confusion. Yeah, let's just go to 13. 13.
I'm sorry, you want to do 13? Okay. With the clerk report, Amendment 13.
Amendment to H.R. 1631, offered by Ms. Lofgren of California, strikes line 20 on page 8 through line 2 on page 9 and inserts the following.
The amendment will be considered as read, Amendment 13, and the gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
There aren't very many requirements that are imposed on the SDOs by this bill, but for those few obligations, I think the burden of proof should be with the SDOs to demonstrate that they have complied with the necessary requirements, not with a party who alleges noncompliance. I do that because I suggest this because it's the little guys who are seeking access. It's the people, it's the homeowners association that doesn't have the money. It's the NAACP tenants organizing group that's trying to fight discriminatory housing provisions. It's people, the little guy that doesn't have the big bucks. And as I mentioned, and we put into the record, most of these SDOs are very well heeled, and they ought to be the one bearing the expense to prove that they have complied with the standards, the few standards that are incorporated, should there be an allegation that they have not. I would note that, for example, Ms. Raw's amendment as to searchability imposes an obligation for the blind, accessibility obligations. We have imposed other obligations in terms of the, very minimal, I would say, in terms of the so-called rooms where people can take a quick look at what the law is that they're supposed to comply with. At least we ought to make sure that those minimal standards have been adhered to. And I think the burden of proof that they have been complied with should be on the standard-setting organizations, not the little guys who are arguing that they have not. It's a simple amendment. It's procedural but important, and I would hope that we might be able to adopt that as part of a justice moment. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
I think the gentlelady, anyone?
I seek recognition.
The gentleman from Florida seeks recognition. Move to strike the last word. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in support of the gentlelady from California's amendment because this whole exercise is one in corporations and businesses oftentimes against the little guy. And I think that the amendment would at least try to remediate some of that by placing the burden of proof on the entity that has the greatest capability to demonstrate that they are able to meet it. Again, the people who will benefit from the passage of this bill are the people who run organizations and groups that devise standards that then have the force of law on the American people. And I believe if you have the power to create something that has the force of law against the American people, that should be accessible on any terms by the people. You shouldn't shoehorn people into some specific website. You shouldn't hope they know precisely where to go. Anyone and everyone should be able to draw on the law and repackage and recreate and distribute and socialize that so that people have notice of the law. Law does not have its own fiat. Law exists and standards exist to provide notice to people so they're able to adhere to it. And my worry is that we're green lighting a system that allows the law to be monetized rather than to be truly executed and adhered to. And so shifting the burden of proof is appropriate. I also think that the $90 million revenue number is appropriate because you're not talking about some small little union or some small little trade group. The way the gentlelady's crafted the amendment, if you have total revenue exceeding $90 million, first of all, I can't even believe we're doing this bill for those folks to create a new vector of revenue for them at the expense of America's do-it-yourselfers, but of which I'm not. Okay, the three words that terrify me almost more than any other are some assembly required. So I'm not doing this for myself, but I know a lot of people who want to be able to access the provisions that they would comply with to redo their deck or fix their roof, and this whole bill's moving us in the wrong direction. The amendment attempts to remedy that, attempts to put the law on the side of the little guy, and that's why I'll support it. I would yield to the gentlelady from California if she had anything else to add. I'll yield back.
No, Mr. Chairman, I have found the correct 18, so I'll offer that after this is dispensed with. Thank you.
Yield back.
The gentlelady from North Carolina.
To speak on the amendment, I just want to say that I oppose the amendment. I'm almost always for the little guy and making it easier to be in litigation. But what we've learned during this hearing is that there are a whole bunch of people who are going to probably want to immediately file suit to gum up the works and to hold these folks to a higher standard. And so if there already wasn't such a large constituency ready to pounce, I might be sympathetic, but given that there's clearly a large constituency, I don't think that serves anybody's purpose. Thank you, and I yield back.
Would the gentlelady yield?
Yes.
Save us double timing. I join with the gentlelady opposing the amendment. I might note that any city, county, state, if they chose, instead of by referencing the book, they wanted to cut and paste 1,000 pages into their laws, they could do so. I might note that if they did so, they would completely comply with the complaint we're hearing here, while not giving any real ability to machine search or use properly this information. The reality is that one of the things that we're trying to preserve is a better way for the do-it-yourselfer and the contractor and others to be able to access the information. Additionally, I might note to the gentlelady from California that shifting the burden of proof is an extraordinary situation, particularly considering every city and every state would also have standing if they felt this law had not been properly agreed to, and that their attorney general or others could force the SDO to do an even better job. So I'm opposing the amendment. I thank the gentlelady, and I yield back. Does anyone else seek recognition?
And I yield back.
And the gentlelady yields back. Mr. Ivey.
I'm just trying to get a sense of who would be suing who and under what circumstances, how the burden of proof would play out in that scenario. I'll yield to anyone who wants to answer. Mr. Chairman.
Well, that's one of the challenges is when you shift the burden of proof to prove a double negative, you want me to prove that I'm not doing something when in fact the law says what they must do. If they're failing to do it, then the Attorney General or anyone should be able to say, you didn't meet that standard.
If the gentleman would yield, I
will.
mean, here's a off the top of my head example. You're a blind person. You go to look into, to try and access the law, it's supposed to be accessible, and it has not been made accessible as required by the Act. Is the blind person going to have the burden of proof? Or should the, the standard setting where they have millions of dollars in revenue have the burden of proof that they have actually complied? That's one example, just of a few just off the top of my head.
Anyone else? I yield back.
Okay, the gentleman yields back. Does anyone else seek recognition? Seeing none, the question is on the amendment to the amendment in nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The noes have it.
I would ask for a recorded vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Jordan? Mr. Issa?
No.
Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes yes. Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey? Mr. Roy? Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparks? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swallow? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy?
Aye.
Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, gentleman from New Jersey. Yes, the chair would announce that when we leave for the votes, we will recess this markup until a time certain, which will be 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, because the subcommittee will be opening when we come back.
Mr. Gooden votes no. Mr. Jordan votes no.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 5 ayes and 10 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. Question occurs.
Mr. Chairman?
I know.
Chairman?
Have they just called votes?
I have an amendment at the desk,
You do?
several.
Go figure. Let's maybe get another amendment done then before we go vote. The gentlelady is recognized for her amendment.
Amendment number 17.
Our clerk will.
Amendment to H.R. 16.
Without objection, the amendment.
Object.
What? Oh, the clerk will proceed with reading the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1631, offered by Ms. Lofgren of California, strikes line 7 on page 8 through line 19 on page 8 and inserts the following: standards incorporated by reference into law or regulation, a standard to which copyright protection subsists under section 102A at the time of its fixation shall retain such protection, notwithstanding that the standard is incorporated by reference if the applicable standards development organization within a reasonable period of time after obtaining actual or constructive notice that the standard has been incorporated by reference makes all portions of the standard so incorporated publicly accessible online at no monetary cost and in a format that includes a searchable table of contents, index, and searchable full text.
California is recognized to explain her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of issues. In the manager's amendment, there was a completely insufficient search provision added. Searching the index really doesn't do much if you want to search what the law is. And so this amendment would require the search standards to be the entire law, which if you're going to adequately use the law is necessary. I would note, and I've objected to the requirements that are made to give up your personal identifiable information, to give up your email, and a lot of other private information in order to gain access to the law. That's just completely inconsistent with the rule of law, with due process, and with the court decisions. But this amendment doesn't address that. It only addresses charging money to gain access to the law. Under this amendment, the standard-setting organizations would have to make the entire law that is incorporated by reference searchable. and they couldn't charge people for searching it. They could still extort the personal information, much as I object to it. They just couldn't charge for it. I do think that this wouldn't let me support the bill, but it does improve the bill. At least people aren't being charged real money to find out what the law is that they're required to abide by. And also, it would allow people who have gained access to at least search what the law is. Many of these standards are highly technical. They go on for hundreds of pages. And under the current system, as I noted at the beginning of this markup, if you're on page, 150 of a 500-page document and you back up, you can't back up. You have to start from the beginning and go all over again. It's really a dysfunctional site for the public to utilize, and being able to search the entire site at no cost to the citizen, I think, is a big improvement to the underlying bill, flawed as it still is. So I would hope that we could, since it does incorporate some things that we oppose in the personal information issue, the cookies that allows the standard setting organization to sell your personal information to other organizations to market things to you, that would not be disrupted. It would just be charging for access that would be permitted under this search obligation that would be added. I would hope that we might be able to come together and approve this, even though it is far short of what needs to be done on the underlying overall bill. I would hope that we could vote yes on this, and to save time, and I know that a vote has been called on the House floor, I would be happy to yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I wish I could, support this, but, the interesting thing we said earlier is that there's nothing in this bill that prohibits a city from incorporating 100% of a standard into the law and then making it searchable. This additional mandate on an organization that's making a free portal because simply as a matter of courtesy in the law is questionable.
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
Of course.
Am I to understand that it's your belief that a local government could download the entire material incorporated by reference by the state and then post it and make it searchable?
A government entity, when adopting, could in fact place the entire content of what it's adopting in there and then make it machine searchable. The difference would be that would be the entity that is posting it as a law. Oddly enough, when cities do that and states do that, they generally don't make it nearly as searchable as this already will be, which is one of the reasons that LexisNexis and the other entities have done so well.
Further question, if I may. I mean, a situation, for example, that Sonoma County was complaining about. State of California adopts a law, incorporates it by reference. They have to pay money to the private entity to find out what the law is that they're supposed to enforce. Are you suggesting that they could actually somehow get those 500 pages, publish them themselves?
As far as we can see in the law, there's nothing in what we're doing.
So copyright enforcement would not apply to a public entity?
They would be posting a law which is in fact available and searchable under this bill. They would be posting it on their, the question of whether they would choose, let's say the state of California would choose to make it machine searchable. To be honest, the level of searchability of California laws is not good right now, but they would have the ability to do it.
If I may further, this is a very interesting discussion. I know we don't have time to fully explore it, but I don't think what you're saying is clear from the text. I'm excited that you believe it's what the text says. I may work on some an amendment that we might go together that makes what you're saying clear, very clear in the text.
I'll certainly say that nowhere in our bill do we prohibit the cities or states from posting. We do stand short of full searchability for a reason, is you're asking for people to make something interoperative in a way that may far exceed a particular capability of that site. Remember that what's happening as we speak is that the revenue, and you mentioned that these organizations still have revenue, the revenue is, in fact, that their real customer, the customer that they want to protect from losing, is the customer that buys the book and uses the book on the job site and is thrilled to do it. Nobody wants to pay for a library or for a book in school or for this book, but it is, in fact, an incredible tool. And so I've never seen a job site that doesn't have this kind of document in addition to an iPad. So that's what they're trying to protect, and that's what we want to do by protecting the fact that they do not lose their copyright, even though they're making 100% of the law/standards available to the public. With that, I would ask people to oppose this amendment and yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I loathe this underlying bill with the fire of 10,000 suns. And I do so because we should not charge for access to the law. I cannot believe in the Judiciary Committee we are having this debate. And certainly, if we're even contemplating charging for access to the law, we should, at a minimum, adopt the gentlelady's amendment that searches should not be charged. But even the fact that we have to offer this amendment demonstrates the absurdity of the underlying legislation. The purpose of the law is to put people on notice. It's not some sort of treasure hunt. You're not looking for a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. You're trying to figure out how to comply with the law. And I also think that the gentlelady's amendment addresses a very real concern many Americans have about data privacy. I don't know, as Americans are having to be shoehorned into this particular process that the legislation contemplates, what I don't really understand is how the cookies are going to work and how people are going to have their data collected and how that's going to be shared. So now the special interests don't just get figuring out how to get their particular demand into the law that everybody complies with. Not only do they get to charge for it, but now they could potentially charge for search and then could potentially, I don't know, sell or alienate the data in some way.
Would the gentleman yield?
Certainly I'd yield.
Because this is taken directly off of these, public reading rooms. This one from ASTM. It says they use a full range of cookies, including tracking and analysis cookies that go to third parties. Here's what a direct quote. These cookies may be set through our site by our advertising partners. They may be used by those companies to build a profile of your interests and show you relevant adverts on other sites. That's your answer.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the gentlelady yielding back and for illuminating the point. Like, how much sweeter do we have to make the deal for the people who are already getting to impose a requirement on the rest of us? This legislation is a solution in search of a problem. It is a special interest giveaway. And what I honestly believe is the real difference here is that the outside groups who support this legislation have lots of revenue, lots of power, and lobbyists. And the people who are going to suffer as a consequence of this legislation have no PAC, have no special interest, have no lobbyist. They're just regular Americans who want to get access to law. They don't want their data stripped. They don't want to be charged for search. And it is disappointing that we are considering this. If this amendment is adopted, I will still not vote for the bill, but with something so antithetical to our values, I think that it is incumbent upon us to at least try to ameliorate all of the harm in this bill that is being presented. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Question occurs on the amendment. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No.
What's the recorded vote?
Recorded vote being requested. The clerk call the roll.
Mr. Jordan?
No.
Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Gates? Mr. Gates votes aye. Mr. Biggs? Mr. McClintock? Mr. Tiffany? Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes aye. Mr. Roy? Mr. Roy votes aye. Mr. Bishop? Ms. Sparts? Mr. Fitzgerald? Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Bentz? Mr. Klein? Mr. Klein votes no. Mr. Armstrong? Mr. Armstrong votes no. Mr. Gooden? Mr. Van Drew? Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Nels? Mr. Moore? Mr. Moore votes no. Mr. Kiley? Ms. Hageman? Ms. Hageman votes no. Mr. Moran? Ms. Lee? Mr. Hunt? Mr. Fry? Mr. Nadler?
No.
Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren?
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Schiff? Mr. Swalwell? Mr. Liu? Ms. Jayapal? Mr. Correa? Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon? Mr. Neguse? Ms. McBath? Ms. Dean? Ms. Escobar? Ms. Ross? Ms. Ross votes no. Ms. Bush? Mr. Ivy? Mr. Ivy votes aye. Ms. Ballant? Ms. Ballant votes aye.
Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, there are 7 ayes and 10 noes.
The amendment is not adopted. The committee will stand in recess until tomorrow at 10 and then resume markup, starting with this legislation.